It was a crisp morning in Florida, the kind that makes you think the universe might actually be on your side for once. John, our protagonist, was standing on the deck of his newly acquired lakefront property, sipping coffee from a mug that boldly declared, *World's okayest hunter. He had spent months searching for the perfect slice of paradise. A secluded patch of land far away from nosy neighbors, barking dogs, and the soul-crushing tyranny of homeowners associations. This was his sanctuary, his Eden. He had even named the lake Duck Haven, in honor of his favorite pastime, hunting waterfowl. But as John admired the serene water and mentally planned his next hunting expedition, his tranquility was shattered by the sight of a man marching up his driveway. The man was wearing a polo shirt tucked into khakis with an air of authority that screamed HOA president. His name tag read Richard, but John immediately dubbed him Dictator Dick in his mind. Dictator Dick carried a clipboard and wore an expression that suggested he hadn't smiled since the Clinton administration. "Good morning," Richard barked, though it sounded less like a greeting and more like an accusation. John raised an eyebrow. "Morning. Can I help you?" Richard didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I'm here to inform you that this property is part of our HOA jurisdiction." John blinked. "Excuse me? This property isn't part of any HOA. That's why I bought it." Richard smirked, the kind of smirk that only HOA presidents and DMV employees can pull off. "I think you'll find that it is. The lake is considered communal property under HOA guidelines." John stared at him, trying to process the absurdity of what he'd just heard. "Communal property? I bought this land outright. I have the deed." Richard waved his clipboard dismissively, as if deeds were mere suggestions in his world. "Well, we have verbal agreements with long-standing residents that establish this lake as part of our community." "Verbal agreements?" John repeated incredulously. "Are you seriously telling me that my legally purchased property is governed by verbal agreements?" Richard puffed out his chest like a rooster preparing for battle. "That's correct. And as HOA president, it's my duty to ensure compliance with our rules." John couldn't help but laugh. A short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Let me get this straight. You're claiming my lake is part of your HOA based on some imaginary verbal contract?" Richard's face darkened. Clearly, he wasn't used to being laughed at. "This isn't a joke, Mr. John," he said flatly. "Well, Mr. John," Richard continued with exaggerated politeness, "if you don't comply with our regulations, I'll have no choice but to escalate this matter." John leaned against the railing of his deck and took another sip of coffee. "By all means, escalate away." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Fine. I'll call 911. John nearly choked on his coffee. "You're going to call the cops because I'm standing on my own property? You're violating HOA rules," Richard snapped. "Rules I'm not bound by," John countered. But Richard was already dialing his phone, muttering something about trespassing and unauthorized hunting activities. John watched in stunned silence as Dictator Dick launched into what could only be described as the most dramatic 911 call in history. "Yes, officer," Richard said loudly enough for John to hear every word. "We have a situation here involving illegal hunting on communal property." John rolled his eyes so hard he thought they might get stuck in the back of his head. Minutes later, 2 police officers arrived at the scene, one looking mildly annoyed and the other clearly regretting every life choice that had led him to this moment. "What seems to be the problem?" asked Officer Number 1. Richard launched into a tirade about HOA regulations, communal property rights, and John's blatant disregard for authority. The officers listened patiently before turning to John. "Sir, do you have proof that this property belongs to you?" Without missing a beat, John walked inside and returned with a folder containing every legal document related to his purchase. Deed, survey maps, zoning permits, the works. Officer Number 2 examined the papers and nodded. "Everything checks out. This land is privately owned." Richard's face turned an alarming shade of red that made John wonder if he should offer him some water, or perhaps CPR. But, Richard sputtered like an old lawnmower trying to start. Officer Number 1 held up a hand to silence him. "Unless you have legal documentation proving otherwise, There's nothing we can do here. Richard looked like he wanted to argue but wisely kept his mouth shut. The officers left shortly after, leaving Dictator Dick standing in John's driveway like a defeated cartoon villain. "You haven't heard the last of this," Richard hissed before storming off. John watched him go with a bemused smile. Then he grabbed a piece of cardboard and a marker from inside his house and made a sign. "Private property. Not part of HOA. Trespassers will be mocked." He planted it firmly at the edge of his driveway before heading back inside to plan tomorrow's hunting trip. As he sat down at his kitchen table with another cup of coffee, John couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. He had moved out here to escape meddling neighbors and power-hungry bureaucrats, but apparently not even paradise was safe from Dictator Dick and his clipboard army. Still, if this was how things were going to be, John figured he might as well enjoy himself. After all, revenge is best served cold, and preferably with duck confit on the side. John had always prided himself on his ability to stay calm under pressure, but as he sat in his living room staring at the freshly planted, private property, not part of HOA sign in his yard, he couldn't help but feel a simmering anger bubbling beneath the surface. Dictator Dick's audacity was one thing, but calling 911 over a man standing on his own property? That was a new level of absurdity. John knew this wasn't over. People like Richard didn't back down, they doubled down. And sure enough, the very next morning, Richard returned, clipboard in hand and smugness dialed up to 11. "Good morning, Mr. John," Richard said with a tone that suggested he'd spent all night practicing his condescension in front of a mirror. John didn't bother with pleasantries this time. "What do you want now?" Richard adjusted his glasses dramatically, as if preparing for a courtroom scene in a bad TV drama. "I've reviewed our HOA bylaws once again and consulted with several long-standing residents. It's clear that your lake is part of our community." John set his coffee cup down with deliberate care, silently reminding himself that assaulting someone with ceramic was frowned upon by the legal system. "You consulted residents? I don't care if you consulted Nostradamus. The deed says this land is mine." Richard ignored him and pointed to his clipboard. "According to Article 7, Section 3 of the HOA bylaws." "Stop right there," John interrupted. "I'm not part of your HOA. Your bylaws are about as relevant to me as the rules of Monopoly." Richard's face twitched, but he soldiered on. "As president of the HOA, I have a duty to protect communal property." "Communal property?" John cut him off again, standing up this time. "Richard, let me spell it out for you. This is not communal property. This is my property. I bought it. I own it. And unless you can produce some kind of magical document that says otherwise, you're trespassing." Richard's smirk faltered for just a moment before he regained his composure. "If you continue to hunt on this lake without HOA approval, I'll be forced to take legal action." John laughed. A loud, genuine laugh that startled even himself. "Legal action? You mean like calling 911 again? How did that work out for you last time?" Richard bristled but refused to back down. "This isn't a joke." "Oh, it's definitely a joke," John replied, crossing his arms. "The punchline is you standing here pretending you have authority over land you don't own." Richard opened his mouth to retort but was interrupted by the sound of tires crunching gravel. Both men turned to see a police cruiser pulling into the driveway. Again. "Ah," John said dryly. "Your favorite backup singers have arrived." The same officers from yesterday stepped out of the car, looking even more annoyed than before. "What's going on now?" asked Officer Number 1. Richard launched into another tirade about communal property rights and unauthorized hunting activities while John stood silently, arms crossed and eyebrows raised so high they were practically in orbit. When Richard finally paused for breath, Officer Number 2 turned to John with an expression that screamed, "Why do we keep getting dragged into this nonsense?" "Sir," he said tiredly, "do you have your paperwork, AG?" John nodded and handed over the folder containing his deed and survey maps. Officer Number 2 flipped through the documents before handing them back with a sigh. "Everything still checks out." Richard sputtered like an old car trying to start in winter. But, Officer Number 1 held up a hand to silence him. Unless you have legal documentation proving otherwise, there's nothing we can do here. Richard looked like he might actually explode from sheer indignation. Fine, he snapped after a long pause. I'll take this matter to court. John couldn't resist one last jab. Oh good. Maybe the judge can explain property law to you, since you clearly missed that day in school. The officers left shortly after, leaving Richard standing in the driveway muttering threats under his breath. As soon as Richard stormed off, John grabbed his phone and called his lawyer. A sharp-tongued woman named Susan who had built her career dismantling overreaching HOAs one petty lawsuit at a time. You're going to love this one, John began after Susan picked up. Susan listened intently as John recounted the saga of Dictator Dick and his clipboard crusade against Duck Haven. When he finished, Susan chuckled darkly. Oh, I've dealt with people like him before. They think being on an HOA board makes them king of the world. Well, John replied with equal parts frustration and amusement. This king is trying to annex my lake. Susan promised to start digging into the HOA's bylaws and any public records related to their claims of ownership over the lake. Meanwhile, John decided it was time for some good old-fashioned revenge. Not the illegal kind, he wasn't that stupid, but the kind that would make Dictator Dick regret ever setting foot on his property. He started by putting up more signs around Duck Haven. Private property? No trespassing of violators will be photographed and ridiculed online. Then he added another sign just for fun. HOA free zone. Enjoy the freedom. Next came the duck decoys. Hundreds of them scattered across the lake like tiny soldiers preparing for battle. If Richard wanted to claim communal ownership over Duck Haven, he'd have to deal with an army of plastic ducks first. Finally, John set up a camera on his deck aimed directly at the driveway. Not for security purposes, though that was a bonus, but so he could capture every ridiculous interaction with Dictator Dick for posterity, and maybe even YouTube fame. By the end of the day, Duck Haven looked less like a serene lakefront property and more like an eccentric art installation designed by someone with too much free time and a grudge against authority figures. And honestly, John couldn't have been happier. Let Dictator Dick come back tomorrow or not at all. Either way, John was ready for whatever nonsense came next, because if there was one thing he'd learned from this whole ordeal, it was that revenge really is best served cold. Preferably while sipping coffee from a mug that says * world's okayest hunter. *. By the time Richard made his next move, John had already settled into a routine of what he liked to call strategic trolling. Every morning, he'd sip his coffee on the deck, surrounded by his army of plastic ducks, while occasionally glancing at the camera feed from his driveway. He even started naming the decoys. There was Commander Quackers, Sergeant Splash, and his personal favorite, Admiral Waddles. If Richard wanted to wage war over Duck Haven, John was more than happy to play along. And then it happened. One fine afternoon, as John was cleaning his hunting gear, he heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling into his driveway. He checked the camera feed and wasn't surprised to see Richard stepping out of his car. But this time, Dictator Dick wasn't alone. He had backup. 2 other HOA board members who looked like they'd been dragged there against their will. One was an older woman clutching a binder so thick it could double as a weapon, and the other was a man in a Hawaiian shirt who appeared to be deeply regretting every life choice that had led him to this moment. John smiled to himself. Well, he muttered. The cavalry has arrived. He walked out to greet them, making sure to carry a mug that said *. I don't argue. I explain why I'm right. *. Afternoon, folks, John said cheerfully. What brings you to my humble lake today? Richard stepped forward like a general preparing for battle. We're here to resolve this matter once and for all. John raised an eyebrow. Oh, does that mean you've finally brought some actual evidence? Richard ignored him and gestured dramatically toward the lake. As you can see, this body of water is clearly part of our community. John blinked. You mean the lake that's literally surrounded by my property? The one I paid for? That lake? The older woman with the binder cleared her throat nervously. Mr. John, we understand your perspective, but the HOA has historical claims. Historical claims? John interrupted with a laugh. What is this, Game of Thrones? Are you about to tell me your ancestors fished here in 1723? The man in the Hawaiian shirt snorted but quickly covered it with a cough when Richard shot him a glare. "We're serious," Richard said through gritted teeth. "This lake has been considered communal property for decades." John crossed his arms and leaned against the deck railing. "And yet no one thought to put that in writing? Fascinating." Richard's face turned an impressive shade of red. "We don't need your sarcasm." "Oh, I'm not being sarcastic," John replied with a grin. "I'm genuinely fascinated by how far you're willing to go without a shred of legal documentation." The older woman stepped forward again, flipping through her binder like it held the secrets of the universe. "We do have records from previous HOA meetings where residents discussed using the lake for community events." John tilted his head. "Discussed? So, no actual agreements or contracts, just some friendly chats over cookies and lemonade." "Well, yes," she admitted reluctantly. John clapped his hands together. "Great. Then I'll be sure to bring cookies and lemonade next time we discuss my private property." The man in the Hawaiian shirt couldn't hold back this time and let out a full-blown laugh before quickly pretending to cough again. Richard looked like he was about to pop a blood vessel. "Enough. We're giving you one last chance to comply before we escalate this further." John's smile widened. "Oh, please escalate it. In fact, let me help you." He pulled out his phone and dialed Susan, putting her on speaker. "Hello." Susan's sharp voice came through loud and clear. "Hey Susan," John said casually. "I've got Richard here with two of his HOA minions. Board members, and they're claiming my lake is communal property again." Susan didn't miss a beat. "Oh good. I've been waiting for this call." Her tone was so icy it could have frozen Duck Haven solid. Richard's confidence wavered as Susan continued. "Mr. Richard, or should I call you Dictator Dick? I've reviewed every public record related to your HOA and found absolutely no evidence that supports your claim over my client's property. In fact, your bylaws don't even mention the lake." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but Susan steamrolled right over him. "Furthermore," she added with relish, "if you continue harassing my client or trespassing on his property, I'll have no choice but to file a cease and desist order against you personally and possibly pursue damages for emotional distress." John couldn't help but laugh at that last part. Emotional distress might have been pushing it, but watching Richard squirm was worth every penny he was paying Susan. The older woman with the binder looked like she wanted to disappear into thin air, while Hawaiian shirt guy had officially given up, pretending not to enjoy himself. "This isn't over," Richard muttered weakly before turning on his heel and marching back to his car. "Oh, I think it is," Susan called out cheerfully through the phone. As Richard and his reluctant entourage drove away, John turned back toward the lake with a satisfied grin. He could practically hear Admiral Waddles quacking in approval. Later that evening, as John sat on his deck enjoying a well-deserved beer, he couldn't help but reflect on how ridiculous the whole situation had become. All he'd wanted was some peace and quiet, a place where he could hunt ducks without interference from power-hungry HOA presidents or their binders full of nonsense. But if there was one thing John knew for sure now, it was this. When push came to shove, he wasn't just defending Duck Haven. He was defending every homeowner who'd ever been bullied by an overzealous HOA board member with too much time on their hands. And honestly, that felt pretty damn good. The next week passed in relative peace, which, for John, felt like a suspicious calm before the inevitable HOA storm. He spent his days fishing on Duck Haven, occasionally waving at his plastic duck army like a benevolent general inspecting his troops. But he knew better than to think Richard had given up. No, Dictator Dick didn't strike John as the kind of man who let go of a grudge. He was more like a dog with a bone, or in this case, a clipboard with imaginary authority. Sure enough, the storm came in the form of an HOA-wide email that landed in John's inbox one sunny morning. The subject line read, *, Emergency Community Meeting. Lake Property Dispute, *. John opened the email and skimmed through Richard's melodramatic prose, which described Duck Haven as a critical community resource under siege by an uncooperative property owner. It was like reading a bad political thriller, complete with phrases like, our sacred duty, and the survival of our neighborhood's harmony. John couldn't help but laugh. If Richard had spent half as much time reading property law as he did crafting this email, they wouldn't even be in this mess. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at the HOA clubhouse, a beige monstrosity that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated both architecture and joy. John decided to attend, partly out of curiosity and partly because he wanted to see how far Richard would go before crashing into the brick wall of reality. When Saturday rolled around, John arrived at the clubhouse armed with his lawyer Susan, a folder of legal documents, and a travel mug that read asterisk, world's best lake owner. Asterisk Susan was dressed in her usual power suit and carried an air of confidence that could make even the most stubborn HOA board member think twice. The room was packed with residents, most of whom looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. At the front of the room stood Richard, flanked by his two loyal board members, Binder Lady and Hawaiian Shirt Guy. To their credit, neither looked particularly enthusiastic about being there. Richard cleared his throat dramatically and began his speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice dripping with self-importance, "we are gathered here today to address a grave threat to our community." John leaned over to Susan and whispered, "Grave threat? Is he talking about me or Godzilla?" Susan smirked but said nothing. Richard continued, gesturing wildly as if he were delivering the Gettysburg Address. "For decades, this lake has been a cherished part of our neighborhood, a place where families gather, children play, and memories are made." John raised his hand. "Quick question. How many families have gathered on my private property? Because I haven't seen any." A few people in the audience chuckled, but Richard ignored him and pressed on. "Unfortunately," he said with a dramatic sigh, "one individual has chosen to disregard our community's traditions and claim this lake as his own." John stood up. "Because it is my own." Richard glared at him. "Please wait until I've finished." "Oh no," John said cheerfully. "By all means, continue digging your hole." Susan leaned back in her chair with a satisfied smile. She didn't even need to say anything. Richard was doing her job for her. Richard launched into a lengthy explanation of how the lake had been unofficially considered communal property since the neighborhood was established. He cited vague anecdotes from long-dead residents and waved around a copy of the HOA bylaws like it was the Constitution. When he finally finished, Susan stood up and walked to the front of the room. Her heels clicked against the floor with an authority that made even Richard take a step back. "Thank you for that colorful presentation," she began. "Now let's talk about facts." She opened her folder and pulled out several documents, holding them up for everyone to see. "This is my client's deed to his property," she said. "It clearly states that he owns not only the land surrounding the lake, but also the lake itself." She placed another document on the table in front of her. "This is a survey map confirming those boundaries." Then she held up one final piece of paper. "And this is a letter from your own HOA attorney, confirming that there is no legal basis for your claims over Duck Haven." The room fell silent except for the sound of Hawaiian Shirt Guy quietly muttering something that sounded suspiciously like, "I told you so." Richard sputtered like an old engine trying to start. But, Susan cut him off with a smile so sharp it could slice through steel. "But nothing. You have no legal standing here. My client is well within his rights to use his property as he sees fit." Binder Lady looked down at her lap while Hawaiian Shirt Guy suddenly found something very interesting on the ceiling. John decided to twist the knife just a little more. He stood up again and addressed the room. "I moved out here because I wanted peace and quiet. Not because I wanted to spend my weekends dealing with an overzealous HOA president who thinks he owns my lake." Several people nodded in agreement, and one older man in the back muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "About time someone put him in his place." Richard looked around desperately for support but found none. Even Binder Lady avoided making eye contact. Finally, one brave soul raised their hand. A middle-aged woman wearing a sweatshirt that said *Wine Mom*. "Can we vote on this?" she asked. Susan smiled graciously. "Of course you can vote. But just so we're clear, any vote you take won't change my client's legal ownership of Duck Haven." Wine Mom shrugged. "I just want to vote him out as president." The room erupted into laughter and applause as Richard turned an alarming shade of purple. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Richard's reign as HOA president was coming to an unceremonious end. As people filed out of the clubhouse, several stopped to shake John's hand or pat him on the back. "You're a hero," one man said. "I just wanted my lake," John replied with a grin. As he walked back to his car alongside Susan, John felt lighter than he had in weeks. Duck Haven was safe, and so was his sanity. At least until Richard found another hobby or moved to terrorize some other unsuspecting neighborhood. For now, though, victory had never tasted sweeter or more satisfying than watching Dictator Dick get dethroned in front of an entire room full of witnesses. John woke up the next morning feeling victorious, like a king surveying his kingdom. Duck Haven was finally free from the clutches of Dictator Dick, and the HOA's reign of terror had been thoroughly dismantled, or at least humiliated. He brewed himself a celebratory cup of coffee in his favorite mug, *World's Okayest Hunter*, and stepped out onto his deck to bask in the glory of his private lake. The plastic duck army bobbed gently in the water, their tiny faces frozen in perpetual approval. But John wasn't one to rest on his laurels. No, he had plans for Duck Haven, big plans. If Richard wanted to play petty games, John would show him what true pettiness looked like. Revenge wasn't just an action. It was an art form, and John was about to paint his masterpiece. The first step was installing an even bigger sign at the entrance to his driveway. The previous private property, not part of HOA's sign, had done its job, but John felt it lacked pizzazz. So he commissioned a custom-made billboard that read, "Welcome to Duck Haven, private property, HOA free zone. Trespassers will be mocked relentlessly." Beneath the text was an illustration of a cartoon duck wearing sunglasses and holding a hunting rifle. It was both ridiculous and perfect. Next came the flagpole. John planted it right at the edge of the lake and hoisted a flag featuring Admiral Waddles, his favorite decoy, alongside bold letters that read, Independent Republic of Duck Haven. He even declared himself president of this fictional republic and printed business cards with the title, John Smith, President and Supreme Commander of Duck Haven. But John wasn't done yet. He wanted to make sure Richard, and anyone else who dared challenge his sovereignty, knew exactly where he stood. So he wrote an open letter to the HOA and posted it on every community bulletin board, mailbox, and online forum he could find. It read, "Dear HOA members and Dictator Dick, I hope this letter finds you well, or at least mildly irritated. I'm writing to formally announce that Duck Haven is now an independent republic, free from the oppressive rule of your HOA bylaws and verbal agreements that hold as much legal weight as monopoly money. As president of Duck Haven, I invite you to visit our glorious lake, but only if you bring cookies and lemonade, the official currency of our republic. Trespassers will be met with sarcasm, eye rolls, and possibly a plastic duck army. To Richard, I suggest you spend your newfound free time learning property law or perhaps taking up a hobby that doesn't involve harassing your neighbors. May I recommend bird watching? It's peaceful and requires 0 clipboards. Sincerely, John Smith, President and Supreme Commander of Duck Haven." The letter quickly became a local sensation. Neighbors who had previously avoided HOA meetings started stopping by Duck Haven just to see the infamous billboard and flagpole. Some brought cookies and lemonade as a joke. Others simply wanted to shake John's hand and thank him for standing up to Richard's nonsense. Meanwhile, Richard seemed to vanish from public view entirely. Rumor had it he was planning to sell his house and move out of the neighborhood. A rumor John hoped was true but didn't bother confirming. As far as he was concerned, Richard was no longer his problem. But just when John thought things couldn't get any better, Susan called with news that made him laugh so hard he nearly fell off his deck chair. "You're not going to believe this," she said, her voice dripping with amusement. "Richard filed a complaint with the county claiming your lake violates zoning regulations." John snorted. "Violates zoning regulations? What does that even mean?" Susan chuckled. "Apparently, he thinks your plastic duck army constitutes unauthorized structures." John laughed until tears streamed down his face. "You're kidding. I wish I were." Susan replied. "But don't worry. I've already spoken to the county inspector, and they think it's hilarious." Sure enough, when the inspector arrived later that week, he spent more time taking selfies with Admiral Waddles than actually inspecting anything. "This is amazing," the inspector said between laughs. "I'm putting this on Instagram." John grinned. "Feel free to tag Duck Haven." The inspector gave him a thumbs up before declaring everything perfectly legal and leaving with a promise to follow Duck Haven's official Instagram account. With Richard officially defeated and Duck Haven thriving as a local landmark, John decided it was time for one final act of revenge, turning his story into internet gold. He set up a YouTube channel called Life on Duck Haven and began uploading videos documenting his battle with Dictator Dick, complete with dramatic reenactments starring Commander Quackers and Sergeant Splash. The channel quickly gained traction, attracting viewers who loved watching petty HOA drama unfold with a side of humor. In one particularly popular video titled, "How I Defeated Dictator Dick," John stood in front of his billboard, holding Admiral Waddles, while recounting every ridiculous interaction with Richard in painstaking detail. He ended the video by saluting his plastic duck army and declaring, "Victory belongs to Duck Haven." The comments section exploded with praise. This is the kind of petty revenge we all aspire to. Admiral Waddles deserves his own spin-off series. HOAs are basically modern-day feudal lords. Thank you for standing up to them. As subscribers poured in, John realized he'd accidentally become an internet sensation, and honestly, he wasn't mad about it. Duck Haven wasn't just a lake anymore. It was a symbol of freedom from HOA tyranny, a beacon for anyone who'd ever been bullied by clipboard-wielding bureaucrats or forced to paint their mailbox beige. And so, as John sat on his deck sipping coffee from yet another mug, President of Duck Haven he couldn't help but smile at how far he'd come. From an ordinary guy looking for peace and quiet to a local legend, leading an army of plastic ducks into battle against HOA oppression. If there's one thing this story proves, it's that sometimes revenge isn't just sweet. It's downright hilarious. Thanks for joining me on this wild ride through Duck Haven. If you enjoyed hearing about my battle against Dictator Dick and my glorious victory, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, leave a comment below about your own HOA horror stories, and most importantly, subscribe for more tales from Duck Haven. Until next time, quack on!